Number 1.
It's been almost 100 years since the family on Hinterkaifeck farm was murdered. Over 100 suspects have been interviewed, but the perpetrator or perpetrators of the crime remain unidentified. The murder of the family was certainly creepy in and of itself, but there were even more creepy things that happened on the Hinterkaifeck family farm, and we'll get to them in a second. 4 people were found slaughtered in the Hinterkaifeck barn. The other 2 victims were murdered in their beds. If you're the type of person who jumps when they hear things going bump in the night, this article is not the one for you. You'll surely be left sleepless and awake for many nights to come. One of the creepiest things about the Hinterkaifeck farm murders is the fact that the suspects was never found. It's true that since the crime was committed almost 100 years ago, it's safe to say the suspect is dead, but it's still creepy to think what killer legacy they might have passed on to other people. Who might the descendants of the Hinterkaifeck murderers be? Father of the family, Andreas Gruber, noticed something strange about a week before his murder. There were footsteps in the snow leading from the woods to his house, but none leading back into the woods. Andreas told neighbors about this, and one neighbor offered to lend Andreas a gun to defend his family with. For whatever reason, Andreas declined. Andreas lived on the farm with his wife Kazilia, their grown daughter Victoria, and their grandchildren Kazilia Jr. and Joseph. It was relatively quiet and safe in the area surrounding Hinterkaifeck farm, so it's possible Andreas convinced himself the footsteps in the snow were nothing to worry about. Something that should have tipped him off, though, was the fact that he'd found a newspaper in the house he never bought. Furthermore, several keys had gone inexplicably missing. That's not even all. The Gruber's previous maid had quit 6 months before. She claimed the house was haunted because she often heard unexplained noises and voices in the attic. The day that the Grubers were murdered, their new maid, Maria, had just begun her first day. If only Maria had started her new job a day later, she could have saved her life. One of the eeriest things about the Hinterkaifeck farm murders is the fact that 4 of the victims seem to have been lured to their deaths. Andreas, Kazilia Sr., Victoria, and Kazilia Jr. were all found butchered to death in the Hinterkaifeck barn. Considering it was the middle of the night, it's logical that each family member was brought there one by one. Maria, however, was killed in her bed, and young Joseph slaughtered in his crib. Investigators believe the family to have been murdered with a farming implement called a mattock. This tool is a sort of pickaxe that has a blade on one side and a pick on the other. Poor Kazilia Jr. was found with clumps of her own hair in her hands, suggesting she was the only one who took a long time to die. Investigators say that Kazilia Jr. might have spent hours lying next to her dead family and writhing in pain. It took about a week for other citizens to really take notice of the missing family. First, Kazilia Jr. didn't show up to school for a few days. Then Sunday came and the Grubers missed church. Because neighbors saw chimney smoke wafting from the farmhouse, no one was really worried something might be wrong. It wasn't until the mailman noticed their mail was piling up that people paid a visit and discovered the gruesome scene. The smoke wafting from the house is a key creepy detail, because this indicates that whoever murdered the family remained in the house at least a few days after the murders. Investigators even found that farm chores like feeding the animals and milking the cow had been taken care of. Perhaps even more chillingly, the fact that the Gruber's old maid had been frightened by sounds in the night indicates that the killers might have been residing in the house months before their horrific crime. Even after almost 100 years and 100 interviews, no one is sure about who is responsible for the Hinterkaifeck farm murders. As with most unsolved cases, several theories have been formed. One hair-raising detail not mentioned about the Gruber family yet is the fact that Andreas and his daughter Victoria had been arrested for incest in 1915. It was thought to be an abusive relationship. Victoria served 1 month in prison, and Andreas was sent away for a year. This horrific fact produced 3 theories. One theory stemming from Andreas and Victoria's incestuous relationship is that Victoria's husband had come back after many years and been horrified to see that Victoria had a child with another man. It was thought by many that Joseph was the product of continued incest, so some thought Victoria's husband went ballistic and killed the whole family. This theory broke down when it was revealed that many of her husband's military comrades attested to him being key in World War I. They even insisted they had seen his dead body with their own eyes. Another theory stemming from the incest was that maybe Joseph had been the son of a nearby neighbor instead. This neighbor had had a son recently die, so it was postulated that he might have been upset that his child with Victoria was the one that survived. This theory didn't hold a lot of water because it was largely speculative, not to mention the same neighbor was the man who offered Andreas a gun to protect his family. The last theory orbiting Andreas and Victoria's incestuous relationship was that one of them might have committed a murder-suicide. This one was quickly dismissed though, because none of their fatal injuries could have been self-inflicted. There are still some other theories buzzing around about the truth of the Hinterkaifeck farm murders. Most notably, students at a German police academy used modern techniques to try to solve the case. They apparently eliminated all suspects except for one, but refused to release this information to the public, since the suspect is already dead anyway. The students thought it more important to protect the privacy of the remaining living family. A 2009 movie named Kaifeck Murder was inspired by the Hinterkaifeck farm murders. In it, the protagonist is a photographer who has been charged with capturing the ways of the local Bavarian people. He soon discovers that a nearby town was the home of a serial killer.
Number 2.
When 8 innocent people lost their lives in a single night, the usually quiet, uneventful town of Villisca, Iowa, changed forever in June 1912. The perpetrator viciously murdered the Moore family and their 2 house guests with an axe. Suspects and confessions have come forward, and even trials were held, but ultimately, the person responsible for the barbaric crimes remains unknown. Now more than 100 years later, the Villisca Axe Murders remain one of the most mysterious cases in history. Located in Montgomery County, Iowa, Villisca boasts a population of around 1,100 residents as of 2019. Back in the late 1890s and early 1900s, Villisca was a thriving town with a close-knit community. Although there were only 2,500 residents in Villisca, it was a hub for developing businesses and a magnet for local tycoons who were eager to capitalize on the area's growth. It was a quiet town, interrupted only by the regular trains which passed through. In addition to the many businesses, Villisca also featured a National Guard armory, funded entirely by the local residents, the first of its kind on U.S. soil. While Villisca still possesses the same small-town charm and appeal it did over 100 years ago, its legacy is forever tainted by the events of June 1912. To this day, the Villisca Axe Murders continue to haunt the small town. Its effects are sewn into the fabric of its history, and never seem to fade even with the passage of time. The entirety of the Moore family and 2 friends of the Moore children were as follows: Josiah B. Moore, 43, Sarah Moore, 39, Herman Montgomery Moore, 11, Mary Catherine Moore, 10, Arthur Boyd Moore, 7, Paul Vernon Moore, 5, Ina May Stillinger, 8, Lena Gertrude Stillinger, 12, the Moore family. The head of the household was Josiah B. Moore. He was a successful businessman in Villisca, excelling at everything he lent his hand to. After he amassed reasonable wealth during his 30s, he later went on to marry and have 4 children with his wife, Sarah. The Moore family was well liked throughout Villisca and gained a reputation for being generous and kind. They were a church-going family who maintained strong contacts and good relationships with many in the community. However, Josiah had a number of enemies in both his personal and professional life. On the morning of June 9th, Josiah and Sarah prepared their children for the busy day they had planned. Their local Presbyterian church was hosting Children's Day. Sarah Moore had worked as one of the co-facilitators of the event, and the entire Moore family would be attending. The activities lasted them through the afternoon and into the early evening, finally ending around 9:30 p.m., after all of the children had finished their performances. 2 neighborhood children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, asked their parents if they could stay over at the Moore's house that night, and their parents agreed. The Moore family, along with the 2 Stillinger girls, left the church and made their way back to the Moore's home as the evening set in. It was a late night for the youngsters, and after milk and cookies for supper, everyone present in the Moore home retired to bed. None of them would be seen alive again. Come morning around 7:30, the usually vibrant Moore household was strangely devoid of activity, and the local neighbor, Mary Peckham, took notice. The curtains were still shut, and none of the 8 occupants had come or gone on their morning routes. Mary called Josiah's brother, Ross, who came to check on the household. He arrived around 8 a.m. and let himself in through the front door. He first inspected the downstairs bedroom, and to his horror, he found 2 blood-soaked sheets covering 2 corpses. They were the bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore. Ross called the local marshal and told him that something terrible had happened. Marshal Henry Horton arrived on the scene 30 minutes later and thoroughly searched the Moore house. He found a dead body in every bed, along with a blood-covered axe still lying in the room where the Stillinger girls lay dead. The entire Moore family and their 2 friends were brutally slain. Word quickly traveled around Villisca. Police officers and a local doctor scrutinized the crime scene and examined the bodies. Dr. F.S. Williams, the first medical officer on the scene, determined that the attacks took place sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. An axe struck each of the victims between 20 to 30 times. This left them mangled and bloody. The blade of the weapon struck Josiah, while the blunt end crushed the rest of the victims. This distinction possibly indicates that Josiah had been the killer's real target. 7 of the 8 victims died while they slept. However, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger may have still been awake when the killer struck. Her body displayed a defensive wound on her arm, and she was lying lengthwise across her bed. There was no decapitation, dismemberment, or sexual assault. The cause of death was brute force trauma to each of the victims' skulls. In Josiah and Sarah's bedroom, the ceiling showed gashes from the axe's upswing. In addition to the sheer brutality on display, there were bizarre discoveries at the crime scene. 2 cigarette butts were discovered in the attic, suggesting that the perpetrator had waited there while everyone in the house went to sleep. He then made his way through the home using an oil lamp, first targeting Josiah and Sarah, and then moving on to the children. Police discovered a plate of food and a bowl of bloody water on the kitchen table, which the killer might have used to wash his hands. He also searched through the drawers and found garments to cover various surfaces in the house, including mirrors and glass panels in the doors. However, most strangely of all was that the killer left a 4-pound slab of bacon in the Stillinger girls' room. The killer took the house keys as he left, locking the doors behind him. By the afternoon of June 11th, a crowd had amassed outside the Moore residence. Dr. F.S. Williams told the audience, "Don't go in there. You'll regret it until the last day of your life." Despite the doctor's warning, the curious residents of Villisca descended upon the Moore house and ventured inside. The crime scene became instantly contaminated, and given the lack of forensic advancements at the time, finding any concrete DNA evidence left by the perpetrator was an almost impossible task. The local police had very few leads. They searched Villisca and the surrounding areas and interviewed some townsfolk. But the killer had at least a 3-hour head start on them, and police believed that he would have already fled the town. Numerous suspects cropped up over the years, some of whom even confessed to the Villisca murders. A traveling minister named Reverend George Kelly arrived in Villisca for the first time on the morning of June 10th to attend the Sunday school directed by Sarah Moore. He then left Villisca at 5 a.m. the next morning on the train heading westbound out of the town. Reportedly, he told some of the passengers that 8 dead bodies were lying back in Villisca several hours before the news had spread. He even mentioned that they had been killed while they slept. Reverend Kelly returned to Villisca 2 weeks later, and after fooling officers into thinking he was a detective from out of town, he was able to latch on to a tour of the Moore house with a group of legitimate investigators. It wasn't until police became aware of Kelly's past that he became a suspect in the Villisca killings. In his teenage years, Kelly had struggled with severe mental illness and also had a history of sexual deviance. Regularly visiting churches throughout Iowa and neighboring states, Kelly had developed a reputation as something of an eccentric. It wasn't until 1917 that a grand jury indicted Kelly for the murder of Lena Stillinger. In August of that year, Kelly confessed to the murder, saying that God had whispered, "Suffer the children to come unto me," in his ear. Given Kelly's history of mental illness, his confession was dismissed. The court later acquitted him and set him free. There was another man by the name of Henry Lee Moore. Though he had no relation to the Moore family, Henry was an alleged serial killer who, only months after the Villisca killings, murdered his mother and grandmother with an axe in a crime that bore striking similarities to the Moore slayings. His motive, he said, was to attain the deed to their Missouri family home. Around the time Henry became a suspect, other similar axe murders were popping up around the country. An officer assigned to the Villisca case became convinced that Henry Moore was responsible for the Villisca killings and a string of similar attacks in Colorado, Kansas, and Illinois. But little evidence tied Henry to the Villisca killings, so it was dismissed. 2 years after the Villisca killings, police turned their attention to an Illinois resident and serial killer. William Mansfield murdered his wife, daughter, and parents-in-law in a way that was eerily similar to the Moore family murders. Later, investigators linked him to other axe murders that happened in Kansas and Colorado, and he was even a suspect in the notorious Axeman of New Orleans case. While the Villisca perpetrator had draped cloth over the mirrors and reflective door panels, the murderer in the Illinois case used sheets to conceal the windows so no one could see in. It later came to light that Mansfield had been in Illinois around the time of the Villisca killings. Indeed, an eyewitness later claimed that he saw Mansfield boarding a train in Clarinda, Iowa, only 20 minutes outside of Villisca. Frank Jones, a Villisca businessman with political sway throughout the town, was another suspect. Several years before the murders, Josiah Moore had been an employee of Jones, but Moore left to start up his own business. In doing so, Moore took a big chunk of Jones' business with him. Moore and Jones despised each other, according to Villisca residents. However, it was considered a stretch that Jones could progress to murdering his business rival. There were also rumors around Villisca that Moore had engaged in extramarital activities with Jones' daughter-in-law. Over 100 years later, the Moore family household still sits on the quiet residential street in Villisca, Iowa. While every other house nearby boasts renovations and refurbishments, the Villisca house remains frozen in time. There's no electricity, the curtains are permanently drawn, and the doors and windows are boarded up. Outside, there's a sign marking the Villisca Axe Murder House. The Villisca House is now an attraction, a spectacle for the morbidly curious tourists. Slightly touched up to maintain its stability, it now exists as a museum. Its interior still boasts the same furniture and beds in which the Moore family and Stillinger girls were cruelly slain.
Number 3.
The discovery of skeletal remains in a wych elm tree during the April of 1943 remains one of the most compelling mysteries of British crime history. Who was the woman whose remains were found in the wych elm tree? Who was responsible for the perplexing graffiti which began to appear a year after the discovery? Was espionage or witchcraft involved? Using pages from the archive, we dive into this fascinating story, which, as the Sunday Mirror comments in 1944, is as fantastic as any thriller. In April 1943, 4 boys went bird nesting in Hagley Wood, which is located just outside of Stourbridge in Worcestershire and lies partway between Birmingham and Kidderminster, when one of them made a shocking discovery. The Evening Dispatch, 29 March 1943, describes the evidence given at the subsequent inquest. Robert Hart of Williscutt, Stourbridge, told the coroner and jury how at midday on Sunday, 18 April, he and 3 other lads went birds nesting in the wood. He left the others and went to the stump of the old elm. Looking in, he saw a skull. He called his friends, and one of them raked the skull out of the tree with a stick and put it back again. When they got home, one of the boys mentioned the find to his father, who telephoned the police. Professor J.M. Webster, director of the West Midland Forensic Science Laboratory, was called to the scene. The tree trunk was opened out, and he was able to reconstruct the skeleton. He found no evidence of violence upon any of the bones. However, he did find part of a garment stuffed deep into the cavity of the mouth, which might have been the cause of death. He did not imagine anyone getting into the tree voluntarily, whilst the skeleton had been there for at least 18 months. With murder suspected, the police were keen to establish the identity of the female victim, as well as that of her killer. A probable description of the victim was published by the Hartlepool Northern Daily Mail, 24 April 1943. Her age is given as between 25 and 40, most probably 35, height 5 feet, with light brown hair, and breast in dark blue and mustard-colored striped cardigan and mustard-colored skirt. Blue crepe-soled shoes, size 5 1/2. All the garments were described as poor quality, and a wedding ring found among the bones was of rolled gold, probably worth 2/6 today. Despite hundreds of leads being followed by police, her identity was not established. The inquest returned the verdict murder by some person or persons unknown. And then, in 1944, the case took on an even more perplexing twist. Chalked on the wall of empty premises on Upper Dean Street, Birmingham, were the words "Who put Bella down the Wych Elm, Hagley Wood?" The Sunday Mirror reports that another message was chalked previously: "Who put Bella down the Wych Elm?" at Hayden Hill Road, Old Hill, but it was not connected to the case until the second piece of graffiti was found. According to the Evening Dispatch, 30 March 1944, the writing was too high on the wall to have been done by boys, and the police are inclined to the view that it is the work of someone coming into the city early in the morning, with farm produce. But, like the victim and her murderer, the identity of the writing's author was never uncovered. In 1949, the case was reopened upon some fresh evidence coming to light, that of gypsies having been seen in the area in preceding years. The link to gypsies is just one of the theories as to why Bella ended up dead in the Wych Elm. In a series of articles in the Birmingham Daily Post in 1968, Donald McCormick takes an extensive look as to who Bella might have been and what might have happened to her. It was theorized that she may have been a prostitute, lured by car to the woods where she then met her death. According to McCormick, the police thought it was more probable that she was a refugee from the Blitz, for many people fled from Birmingham when the German air raids came, and some had been known to shelter in Hagley Wood. He also draws the link to witchcraft. Hagley Wood had the reputation for being the haunt of witches' covens, and more compellingly, there was an ancient tradition that the spirit of a dead witch could be imprisoned in the hollow of a tree, and thus prevented from wreaking any more harm in the world. McCormick, however, does not seem to put much credence to the motive of witchcraft. He cites a letter received by a Wolverhampton newspaper in 1953, which proclaims the affair is closed and involves no witches, black magic or moonlight rites. The writer claims that the victim was a Dutch woman who arrived illegally in England in 1941, and that her killer died insane a year later. McCormick explores the theory that Bella was in fact the Dutch girlfriend of German intelligence recruiter Lehrer, who had had a lover in Kidderminster before the war, and was fluent in English. German intelligence records tell of an agent, codenamed Clara, who was dropped into the area between Birmingham and Kidderminster between March and April 1941. There is nothing to say that she was dropped in Hagley Wood, but she never again made contact with the intelligence agency. So who did put Bella in the Wych Elm? 77 years on from the shocking discovery by the four boys in Hagley Wood, it seems we are no closer to finding the truth. However, the archive does give us a fascinating glimpse of the theories and the legends that have trickled down through the decades of the mysterious Lady of Hagley Wood.